This is going to be part 2 of Attila the Hun, and I'd like to thank everybody who listened to the first part. For those of you who haven't listened to the first part, I recommend you go back and you listen to it. Otherwise, some of the people and places that I talk about may not make as much sense. But if you're one of those people that are very adept at actually jumping into the middle of things, or if you are familiar with this particular period in time, by all means, continue on. If you like what you hear, please give me a like, subscribe, leave me a couple of good comments. But either way, thank you for your time and for listening. I believe that there's a question that every major world leader has had to ask themselves at some point in time. And I'm talking about the entire broad spectrum of human civilization. And I think the question goes something like this. What would you do in order to achieve power? And I'm talking about supreme power. Who would you compromise? Who would you leave at the wayside? What morals, what ethics would you disregard in order to accomplish those goals? And once you achieve that power, what would you do in order to maintain it? I would even take this question a step further. If you read Machiavelli's The Prince, he asks the question, what is better? Is it better to be loved or is it better to be feared? And if you read him, he states that a true leader is someone who's able to actually balance out the two in order to achieve their goals. But he also states that when your civilization undergoes a major point of strife, when things become exceptionally difficult, it is by far safer to be feared. The early to mid 5th century was such a time period for the Roman civilization. Rome had gone from being this giant, this mighty colossus that bestrode the world, if you want to quote Shakespeare, to being this fragmented civilization that now had 2 capitals and had 2 emperors. The western portion of that empire was fragmented. It was losing provinces. Rome itself as a city had lost her importance. She wasn't even the political capital anymore. And in the year 410, she was actually sacked by barbarians. And this wasn't going to be the last time that Rome was going to be attacked. Because, of course, on almost all of her borders, there were barbarians that were waiting for an opportunity to take advantage of Rome's weakness and faded glory. Rome was going to need real leadership at this time, and it got it in the form of a man by the name of Flavius Atheist. This was a man who was a general and also a politician. And in my opinion, I don't believe you can tell the story of Attila the Hun without talking about Flavius Atheist, because these were men that were almost mirror images of one another. Both men were very politically astute. They had the ability to manipulate the system and other people to organize them in order to accomplish their goals. They were exceptional strategists. They had the insight to see the long game, but at the same time, they had the fortitude in order to take great risks. And on the field of battle, both men were extremely adept tactically. They had what was required in order to achieve military victory. Surprisingly, these were men that were friends. They actually fought alongside one another in a campaign in Gaul. But because of their political affiliations, these were men that were destined to confrontation. But whereas Aetius was fighting to save a dying civilization, Attila was pushing his civilization to its zenith. And it was this contest that would determine the course of Western civilization. Our story really begins on the Great Hungarian Plain. This is a portion of grassland in Eastern Europe, which is currently modern-day Hungary, portions of Serbia, and portions of Eastern Romania. It was onto this area that the Huns migrated into after coming off the Asiatic and then the European steppe. As mentioned in my previous podcast, the reason for their migration is still unknown, but they found out quickly after moving into this area that the population density was much different than their homeland. There were many more fixed settlements, and they caught on the idea that instead of just pillaging and destroying these people, it made much more sense to extort money out of them and demand tribute. Within a few generations, the Huns had gone from being completely nomadic people to people who had a fixed base of operations within the Hungarian plain. They had come into contact with both the Eastern and Western Roman Empire, and by doing so, they were actually hired by both empires as mercenaries in order to fight in military campaigns. Now, the Roman account of these military endeavors, again, the Huns didn't have their own written history, so most of the information we know about the Huns comes from the Romans. They state that the Huns were growing in number, in size. They were also growing in organization, and before long, Roman historians actually point out that the Huns had kings. The first of which recorded was a man by the name of Ulden, but there were soon to be many more. Eventually, you get to a man by the name of Rua, who is also known as Regilla, depending on which text you read, but he was the uncle of Attila and his older brother, Bleda. This was a man that was not to be outdone by his predecessors. He gathered his army, and in the year 434, he marched on the Eastern Roman Empire. Rua's campaign blazed a path through the Balkans. Eventually, he and his army arrived at the very gates of Constantinople, which again was the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. But once he got there, he had to contend with the Great Theodosian Walls, which were a series of fortifications on the landward side of Constantinople that were perhaps some of the most impregnable defenses of any city in the age of antiquity and the Middle Ages. Rua and his Huns didn't have the technology to get past these walls. What he opted to do was try to lay siege to it, surround it, and starve the people out. But according to ecclesiastical historians, as he was laying siege, a bolt of lightning in some form of divine retribution struck him down. Rua was never to come back from this campaign alive. But his death did send shockwaves through the higher echelon of Hun society. It created a power vacuum that people like Attila and his older brother Bleda were only too happy to exploit. Now, the details of what these brothers did in order to secure the throne is unknown, but they must have had to move very quickly, because not only did they have to take out all of the progeny of Rua, but they also had to take out any other rival for the throne as well. What is known is by the end of the year 434 CE, Attila and his brother Bleda were firmly in charge of the Hun Empire. The part that surprises me was that Bleda was the older brother, and according to Hun society, it was the older brother that should inherit everything and make all the decisions. I question why wasn't Attila found in some sort of shallow grave or drowned in a river, but I think it speaks volumes about his character that he was actually able to secure for himself a position in this new empire. What we know about Attila and his early childhood is a little limited, but what historians do state is that he was born approximately in the year 406 CE. As Christopher Kelly writes in his book, The End of Empire, he states, and I quote, "Attila the Hun was no son of the steppes. As a member of the most powerful family north of the Danube, Attila had a highly privileged upbringing. Certainly, he was not the homeless, half-starved barbarian child of Ammianus Marcellinus's imagination. The young Attila spent most of his time in the company of his elder brother Bleda. Together they were taught archery, how to fight with sword and lasso, and how to ride and care for a horse. Both were likely to have been taught to speak and perhaps to read Goth and Latin." End quote. There are even reports that in the year 418 CE, when Attila was approximately 12 years old, he was sent to Rome as a political hostage. During his time there, he learned about Roman culture, Roman civilization, but most importantly, he learned about the way in which the Roman mind worked. In retrospect, what an incredible insight to have. I always think of Sun Tzu in The Art of War, where he states that if you know yourself and you know your opponent, you won't be imperiled in 100 battles. It's the same kind of insight that men like Isoroku Yamamoto must have had. He was the Japanese admiral who came up with the attack on Pearl Harbor, but before that, he had studied at Harvard University. He had spent time in America. He was even a naval attaché in Washington, D.C., and learned how to speak fluent English. He tried desperately to convince his Japanese superiors not to plan the attack because he knew that the American response to a sneak attack would be nothing less than all-out war, and that the American psyche and the American people would settle for nothing less than the unconditional surrender of the Japanese. But I digress. Attila was clearly not the mindless savage nomad that men like Ammianus Marcellinus would have you believe. In my opinion, he was the product of an evolving society, a society that was on the verge of developing its own civilization and its own empire, and he had the insight to actually visualize that. Edward Gibbons has an account on Attila, and he states, and I quote, "This savage hero was not inaccessible to pity. His suppliant enemies might confide in the assurance of peace or pardon, and Attila was considered by his subjects as a just and indulgent master. He delighted in war, but after he had ascended the throne in a mature age, his head rather than his hand achieved the conquest of the north, and the fame of an adventurous soldier was usefully exchanged for that of a prudent and successful general. The effects of personal valor are so inconsiderable, except in poetry or romance, that victory even among barbarians must depend on the degree of skill with which the passions of the multitude are combined and guided for the service of a single man." End quote. Bleda and Attila wasted no time in consolidating their power. They began to incorporate other people into their army. They began to expand their land base. They continued to demand tribute from the Eastern Roman Empire in order to fund these operations. I like to think of Christopher Kelly when he writes in his book, The End of Empire, and I quote, "Attila and Bleda inherited an empire established by military force," end quote. It was going to be this guiding principle of military force that was going to guide their actions, because both of them knew that a Hun king, or kings in this case, only stay in power as long as they're able to prove their worth militarily. Now, as they continued to consolidate their power on the Great Hungarian Plain, about 300 to 400 miles away in Ravenna, Italy, another man was also trying to assume power. This was Flavius Atheist, the man that I'd like to think of as Attila's mirror. Atheist was born in approximately 391 CE. He was the son of a Roman general and governor by the name of Gaudentius. Thus, when he was growing up, he had the following three major advantages. Number one, he was born into a position of privilege, and he had the education that came with that position. Number two, as his father was a military leader, he had insight not only into the way in which the political structure of Rome worked, but also in which the logistical system that comprised the Roman army worked. And number three, he was also an aristocrat, and as a result, he was used as a political pawn. In the year 405, he was sent to the Visigoths under their king Alaric. He stayed with them for approximately 3 years, and when he returned, he was sent away again. But this time, in 409, he was sent to Uldin, who was the king of the Huns, and his time with the Huns was a profound learning experience. He learned what type of weapons the Huns used. He learned the methods in which the Huns used them. He learned their tactics. And what's more, he learned the methodology that went behind the Hun mind. Now, let me ask you, does this at all sound familiar? Because it seems that both men had a very similar upbringing, and what's more, their essence of spirit seems to have been forged out of the same kind of mold. They were both type A personalities when it came to military and political conquest, and it seemed like no matter what they achieved, there was always one more thing that they wanted to grasp. In a lot of ways, it kind of reminds me of men like Hernan Cortes, who in 1519 decided to forsake all his riches in the New World and decided to push on to meet up with the Aztec with the intent to conquer them. However, that said, Aetius's rise to power was something out of a soap opera. He was waiting in the wings for a moment to pounce, and that opportunity came in the year 423. The emperor of the Western Roman Empire died. He was a man by the name of Honorius, which, in my opinion, is probably one of the worst emperors that the Roman Empire had ever had. His death without an heir set off a power struggle within the Western Roman Empire, which was almost immediately assailed on by several different contenders for the throne. Now, I'm going to save you the details, but it came down to two people. One was a woman by the name of Galla Placidia, who was truly a battleship of a woman. She was smart, she was intelligent, she was extremely cunning politically. And her contender was a man by the name of John the Usurper, and as you can tell by the name, he didn't quite make it. But before being executed for high treason, John sent out a plea for military aid. As Aetius wanted to jump on the revolutionary bandwagon, he went to the Huns, and using his connections with the upper echelon of Hun society, he actually created a Hun army. And in the year 425, he marched this army on the capital, but he arrived at Ravenna just in time to realize that he had backed the wrong man. As one can imagine, this was a bit of an impasse, because on one end you have Galla Placidia, and more importantly her son Valentinian III, who are actually blood heir. It was their responsibility and their right to assume command of the Western Roman Empire, and what's more, they'd already put all their contenders to death. All that Aetius had was, well, an army of well-trained, well-armed, savage, bloodthirsty Huns at his disposal. And in the days of antiquity, it's only leverage like that can get you a position high within the corporation. So Galla Placidia did the only thing that was left to her. She hired him. She brought him in. She raised Aetius to the rank of Magister Militum per Gallius, which means commander-in-chief of all armies in Gaul. Aetius would forever remain a deplorable, despisable character in Galla Placidia's eyes. She made it a point to surround him with enemies throughout the imperial court, and every opportunity she had to usurp his power and belittle him, she would take advantage of it. I think that most people in Aetius's position would most likely have looked for another job, but Aetius went right to work. In 426, he gathered his forces and went into Gaul for the purposes of reestablishing Roman dominance in that province. He declared war on Theodoric, who was the king of the Visigoths, and was actually able to send him and the Visigoth army packing. He returned to Ravenna to a hero's welcome, and Galla had no other choice but to actually promote him again. And this time he was made Magister Militum, which means commander-in-chief of all military forces. But Galla made it a point to curb his power. She gave the senior position to a man by the name of Flavius Felix, who she felt was much more loyal to her, and for all military concerns, she would favor another general by the name of Boniface, who was commander of all forces in North Africa. Aetius's response was a feat of political daring. He immediately had false accusations brought up against Flavius Felix, and had the man tried and executed along with his wife and son-in-law. For Boniface, who was in North Africa, Aetius had to get a little bit more creative. He started by instilling the idea in Galla Placidia's head that Boniface was starting a revolt in North Africa. He wanted her to recall him to Italy with the idea that if he came on his own accord, he would prove his loyalty. However, right before this conversation was had, he sent a note to Boniface indicating to him that Galla had already decided that he was going to be tried and executed as soon as he came back. So naturally, Boniface didn't come back. And as a result, Galla had no choice but to deem him a rebel and strip him of his military command. Aetius must have truly thought at this point, hey, I'm doing a pretty good job here. One of my rivals is killed off, the other one has been exiled to North Africa. But, as fate would have it, in the year 429, another group of barbarians invaded North Africa, a group known as the Vandals, and Boniface did his part to hold on to Roman-held territory. In fact, he did such a good job that his name was cleared. Galla Placidia reinstated his command, asked him to come back to Italy to assume command of all military forces, and then went so far as to give Boniface the honorary title of patrician. Now, that last part was just an honorary title. It doesn't necessarily mean anything, except when it comes from a woman like Galla Placidia, because her message was clear. She wanted Boniface to be numero uno, and she would rather be dead than ever give a title like that to a Cretan like Aetius. The writing was pretty clear on the wall. Aetius knew that his options were limited and that he would have to have direct confrontation with Boniface if he was to achieve anything. Now, I love Christopher Kelly's account of Boniface's homecoming. He states, and I quote, "Aetius on campaign in France hurried back to Italy to challenge his newly promoted rival. Suspecting this, Galla had urged Boniface never to travel without a large bodyguard. The clash took place in late 432 outside the town of Arminium, which is modern-day Romania, 30 miles down the coast from Ravenna. This was an intensely personal conflict. In the middle of the battle, the two Roman generals faced each other. It was later rumored that, in an anticipation of confronting his rival, Aetius had ordered his lance to be lengthened so that he could attack while remaining out of reach of Boniface's sword. Aetius, it was said, had no intention of offering a fair fight, especially if that meant compromising his chances of killing his opponent. In the struggle, Boniface was fatally wounded, and Aetius forced to flee. Galla Placidia had given Boniface good advice. His troops had defeated Aetius's men, yet even she had not foreseen that in single combat, Aetius might cheat to win. End quote. Less than honorable, but as the old adage goes, all's fair in love and war. This actually brings to mind a story that I read about in Jeff Shahara's book, The Rising Tide. He has a conversation between Eisenhower and one of his subordinates where he's talking about Patton and a war game exercise. He states, and I'm paraphrasing here, Georgie commanded the 2nd Armor. He won the day, pulled a pretty neat trick, got into the enemy camp, took the prize. The official observers said that what he did was impossible, turned the whole event up on its ear. Nobody could figure out how he did it. To which his subordinate says, well, how'd he do it? Eisenhower responds, he cheated, took his armor across country outside the designated boundaries. He'd made a deal with private gasoline stations along the country roads, paid for the gas with his own money, so I was told, planned it all out in advance. To which Eisenhower's subordinate stands aghast and he asks, he cheated? To which Eisenhower responds, he won. I think it was this kind of determination that Aetius held in abundance, because what he was about to do next would be even more daring. He had lost control of his forces, his army was decimated by Boniface, he had to flee, and the place that he fled to was into Hun territory. He made a gamble. He was hoping that his Hun connections would allow him to raise yet another Hun army and again march on the Western Roman Empire. Rua was still the king of the Huns at this particular point in time, and he wanted nothing to do with Aetius's plan. At the very most, he gave Aetius a small contingent force of cavalrymen and basically told him to go on his way. So what happens when Plan A fails? Well, you go to Plan B, which in this case was probably the most outrageous gamble of Aetius's life. He took this small contingent force back to the Roman Empire and demanded a private audience with Galla Placidia. Aetius was calculating that his reputation for military prowess combined with his reputation for having close ties with the Huns would be enough to convince Galla Placidia that he had yet another Hun army under his sleeve, when in reality his army consisted of the few horsemen that surrounded him. Galla Placidia was no fool, but I wonder what her thought process must have been like at this point in time, because she truly had him. All she had to have done was done the proverbial imperial thumbs down, her army would have jumped on top of him, and by nightfall Aetius could have been executed. But for her, there was always that nagging question of what if Aetius might have been actually telling the truth, and right behind him or around the corner there was a large Hun army waiting to attack. This comes across, at least to me, as if it was some sort of surreal, fantastic game of poker, except you don't win money, you win the Western Roman Empire, and if you lose, you end up dead. Just the kind of game that a man like Aetius loved to play. And he got lucky. Galla Placidia bought into it. She reinstated him as supreme commander of all military forces. She even gave him the rank of patrician. And Aetius, a man that not only likes to play games of luck and chance, but he was also a guy who held grudges. He made it a point to buy Boniface's old house. He actually married Boniface's widow, and then he proceeded to bed said widow in said house. What a delightful way to end a grudge, no? Now, this brings us up to the year 434, which is the year that Attila and Bleda assumed command of the Huns. And so instead of having just one megalomaniac coming to power, now you have two, and both of them had an agenda. Aetius was the first to make a move. In 436, he had a group of barbarians in Gaul that he just didn't like. They were called the Burgundians. They were actually quite fierce warriors, and he couldn't quite subdue them. So he went to Attila with the proposition that, hey, let's attack these guys together. I'll throw in some money, you throw in some troops, and why don't we just have a party out of it? Strategically, it made a lot of sense to both men. For Aetius, he'd have the ability to secure Roman lands in Gaul and subdue a potentially violent group of barbarians. For Attila, it made even more sense, because he had plans on attacking the Eastern Roman Empire, and he realized very early on something that the Germans of World War I and even World War II didn't pick up on, which is you don't fight a two-front war. And he figured that if he could attack the Burgundians, he could neutralize them, secure lands along his side of the Rhine, and he would have a free hand to do whatever he wanted to after that. This campaign began in earnest with Roman troops marching alongside their Hun allies. And for the Romans, I'm sure it must have been like having a rabid wild dog that you can teach how to sick on your enemies, because that's exactly what the Huns would do. Every time they would come across a Burgundian settlement, the Romans would attack, but the Huns would take it a step further. They would systematically hunt down man, woman, and child. It didn't make any difference to them. It's about this time when you also started hearing reports of Huns finding other Hun deserters within the Burgundian ranks, and loyalty was perhaps one of their most precious commodities. So for these people, they would have them impaled on giant poles, and they would impale them in such a way that sometimes these men wouldn't die right away, but would languish in agony for days on end before death would finally take them. The Romans didn't seem to care. They turned a deaf ear towards all of this. As long as the job was getting done, it seemed like they allowed the Huns to do whatever they wanted to. And so what began as subduing a group of barbarians turned into ethnic cleansing. By the end of the year, 30,000 Burgundians were dead. And Aetius didn't want to stop there. He wanted to attack other groups in order to solidify his power in Gaul. Thus, this campaign went on for 3 years. Now, the Huns didn't stick around for all of that. They had had their fill of raping and pillaging and destroying and stealing whatever they could steal, and most of them went back into Hun territory. But a couple of them stayed behind to observe what the Romans were going to do. The Romans opted to finish an old score with the Visigoths. They wanted them wiped out. They went into southern France and laid siege to their capital at Toulouse. Aetius put a man by the name of Latorus in charge of this particular army, but Latorus was no Aetius. He couldn't get the job done, and in fact, that particular army was actually wiped out. Latorus was put to death. But let me ask you, what do you think the Huns got out of this? Because again, they had observers watching this going on. We need to evaluate this both at a strategic and also a tactical level, because I think Attila gained a tremendous amount out of this endeavor. From a strategical perspective, he gained the following things. Number one, he was able to secure his western border. Number two, he was able to wipe out, or at least nearly wipe out, the Burgundians and eliminate a potential threat. Number three, he was able to have a free hand to attack the Eastern Roman Empire if he wished. Number four, he was able to secure lands along his side of the Rhine. And number five, he was able to secure his friendship with Aetius and the Western Roman Empire. Tactically, I think the Huns gained even more, because they were able to watch how the Romans acted in the field of battle. They were actually able to see how Roman forces maneuvered, etc. But even more important than that was when the Romans came across a barbarian fixed settlement, which included their siege at Toulouse, because the Romans started bringing out weapons that were still a little new to the Huns, and these included things like catapults and battering rams and siege towers. And trust me, the Huns wrapped up these little nuggets of knowledge for later use. Remember how I'd mentioned to you earlier that when Rua and his Huns arrived at the gates of Constantinople, the walls were just too impregnable, they just didn't have the technology? Well, now, those imperial cities and those imperial walls didn't seem like such a hindrance anymore. But the Huns didn't attack right away. Attila and Bleda played it very smart. They wanted to wait for the right opportunity in which to attack. They knew that the Eastern and Western Roman empires had plenty of other enemies to contend with. And so in the year 439, the Huns sent an envoy to the Eastern Roman Empire in order to establish a new treaty with them. They met in a city by the name of Margum. Margum is located in eastern Serbia. In fact, the modern city of Požarevac is built on its ruins. The treaty actually accomplished quite a few things for the Huns. Number one, it established trade centers so that the Huns could monitor any trade between the two empires. It increased the annual tribute from 350 pounds of gold to 700 pounds of gold. It allowed for Hun refugees that had taken shelter within the Roman Empire to be returned back to the Huns, and most likely to a gruesome death. And it also postulated that the Roman Empire was not to engage in any side alliances with any group of people that were enemies of the Huns. Thus, it gave the Huns free hand to attack and consolidate their power north of the Danube. Now, the final part of the treaty was that all of this tribute that they had previously mentioned would be paid directly to either Attila or Bleda. That way, they would have firm control of where this money was going to. I want to point out one thing. The dates in the Hun chronology are a little skewed depending on which type of resource you read. The dates that I give you are the ones that I've found to be the most consistent. But when it comes to the Treaty of Margum, it's all over the place. Some resources say it was the year 435, some say 436, some go as far as the year 440. But for the purposes of my narrative, the year 439 worked out really well, so I decided to use it. Bleda and Attila didn't have to wait very long for an opportunity to come their way. This opportunity came in the form of the Vandals of North Africa. Now, let me tell you a little bit about the Vandals because they were kind of a displaced people. They started in approximately Central Europe but were pushed out by the incoming wave of Huns. They tried to settle in southern France, but that didn't work out because the Visigoths pushed them out into Spain. And then in the year 429, their king Gesseric realized that even Spain wasn't safe, and so they had to move into North Africa. This, of course, put them into direct conflict with the Romans that were living there, and as I had mentioned earlier, the great general Boniface actually fought several battles with them. But these battles settled into a bit of a stalemate. For a brief period of time, the Romans and the Vandals actually coexisted in North Africa. That is, up until the year of 439, which is the year of my Treaty of Margum. It was this year that the Vandals opened up a new offensive against the Romans. They were able to push out the Roman garrisons. They were actually able to capture the capital city of Carthage. And the very next year, in 440, they built a fleet and successfully invaded and captured Sicily. Now, as you can imagine, this is catastrophic stuff for the Western Roman Empire. They lost their tax base in North Africa. They lost one of their largest cities in the form of Carthage. And what's more, Gesseric and his Vandals were now in a perfect position to strike anywhere they wanted to. I mean, if you look at Sicily on a map, it is a perfect jump point to just about any place in the Western Mediterranean. Valentinian III, who was now the emperor of the Western Roman Empire, he was the son of Galla Placidia, was so freaked out by this that on June 24th, in the year 440, he issued an imperial edict. He states, and I quote, "Gesseric, the enemy of our empire, is reported to have issued forth from the port of Carthage with a large fleet, whose swift transit and a capacity for opportunistic marauding is to be feared along all coastlines." End quote. His message was pretty clear. This wasn't going to be just a problem of the Western Roman Empire. After all, if Gesseric and his Vandals decided to move along the North African coast, they could easily take out the breadbasket of the Eastern Roman Empire in Egypt. And Theodosius II, who was the emperor of the East, took notice. But Theodosius knew that sending his limited troops to the west to help Valentinian, while he had men like Attila and Bleda on his border, would not be an easy sell for his people. In my mind, I can actually imagine what the scene must have been like. Theodosius sitting on his throne, dressed in purple. All of the intricate regalia that's associated with the Eastern court must have been present, including all of his advisors and learned men and eunuchs and whatnot. And he turns over to them and he states, "We need to do this. North Africa needs to be liberated. This is something that if we do not check now, those barbarians are going to walk all over the face of the earth." He also points out that our troops are well trained, they're well armed, they're well provisioned. We've set aside resources to make sure that they're going to do a good job, and with any luck, they're going to be home by Christmas. It's practically a done deal, mission accomplished. And then he reaches over and brings out a piece of paper. He brings out the Treaty of Margam, and he flashes it in front of all of his advisors, and he states, "This treaty is guarantee that Attila's not going to attack us. We've given in to all of his demands. We've appeased him. We have doubled our tribute. And if Attila is a man of his word, there is no possibility that he will ever go to war with us. There will be peace in our time." Well, that's kind of the way it plays out in my mind anyway, but for those of you who picked up on the references, kudos to you, because you can tell which way this one is going to be going. Theodosius made his sale. He was able to convince his advisors that going to Sicily and then onward to North Africa was going to be a good idea. And so in the year 441, his troops boarded ship and set sail for Sicily. The Hun spies that were sent ahead to monitor this reported back to Attila that indeed the troops had gone. And shortly thereafter, Attila and Bleda attacked. I find it interesting that the Huns, before they did this attack, wanted to shift the blame for this war to the Romans. I guess they didn't want to come across as being barbarians. They arrived at the city of Margam, which, by the way, just as a side note, the city of Margam, depending on which text you read, can also come across as the city of Margus. But in either case, they arrived at the city of Margam/Margus, and they demanded that the bishop of that town had illegally crossed over into Hun territory and had raided several Hun burial sites, to which they demanded that the bishop be turned over immediately. The Romans refused, which played directly into Attila's plans, and so you had the pretext for war. The citizens of the city itself knew that they were surrounded and that help really wasn't coming, so they made a plot in order to turn over the bishop anyway. But the bishop must have caught wind of this because he went out of the city, snuck over to Attila, and made a side deal. He promised Attila and Bleda that he would open the city gates, surrender the inhabitants, if they would spare him his life. The Huns readily agreed to this, and then in the middle of the night, when the gates were down, they poured into the city, proceeding to kill every man, woman, and child, and then raze and burn the city to the ground. The fate of the bishop is lost to antiquity, but I can imagine he didn't last for very long. The Huns proceeded to attack a multitude of smaller settlements up and down the banks of the Danube, and then they proceeded into the Morava River Valley. Roman historians give us very little detail of the Hun exploits, and this is something I can understand. I mean, after all, this was a disaster for them. But what they do mention is some of the larger cities that were actually taken. And these include cities like Sirmium, Singadunum, which is modern-day Belgrade, Margam, Viminacium, Serdica, which is modern-day Sofia. And I want to emphasize that these are not just rural villages. These are actually imperial cities with a large population and with imperial garrisons to actually protect them. Christopher Kelly, again, actually has a good account of a Hun attack, and I quote, "At first, a smudge on the horizon. Gradually through the dust, the horses and their riders take shape. Then the sickening realization that this is not help but destruction. The harsh shouts of anonymous men blankly uniform in their helmets and armor, the cruel flash of swords, and the hot flow of blood. There is nothing new about the horrors of war. They do not shock until a brief list of cities destroyed becomes, at least in our imagination, a roll call of thousands of individuals raped, enslaved, or killed." End quote. It's about at this time when Roman historians start giving accounts of Hun atrocities, things that, without doubt, future generations would construe as being war crimes, accounts of men, women, children, civilian and soldier alike being crucified as far as the eye can see, mass executions occurring in front of other populaces. There's even stories of Huns dipping their arrows into the boiling fetuses of slain women in order to appease their war gods and make their arrows shoot straight. One of the major atrocities that occurred was when the Huns arrived at the city of Nisus. They got there in the year 442, a few months into this campaign. Nisus wasn't just an imperial city. 150 years prior to this, it was actually the birthplace of Constantine the Great, who was the emperor who actually founded the Eastern Roman Empire. The city was built up. It was beautiful. It was supposed to be the jewel of the Balkans. It had a series of fortifications and towers, and the Romans put a lot of emphasis and stock in these defenses because the garrison that protected the city was probably not as big as it should have been. And to some extent, it makes a little bit of sense because barbarian groups that had come through this area usually stuck to pillaging the countryside and would usually avoid cities like this because they simply couldn't get into them. But in this case, I think the Romans miscalculated because they didn't count on the fact that the Huns had evolved in terms of their military technology. And at the siege of Nisus, the Huns had brought something new. Priscus of Panemon is a contemporary historian, and he actually gives us an account of what the Romans now had to face. And I quote, "When a large number of Hunnic siege engines had been brought up to the wall, the defenders on the battlements gave in because of the cloud of missiles and evacuated their positions. The so-called rams were brought up also. This is a very large machine. A beam is suspended by slack chains from timbers which incline together, and it is provided with a sharp metal point and screens for the safety of those working it. With short ropes attached to the rear, men vigorously swing the beam away from the target of the blow and then release it. From the walls, the defenders tumble down wagon-sized boulders. Some rams they crushed together with the men working them, but they could not hold out against the great number of machines. Then the enemy brought up scaling ladders. The barbarians entered through the part of the circuit wall broken by the blows of the rams, and also over the scaling ladders, and the city was taken." End quote. The destruction of Nisus was complete. There was nothing left. The city was left in smoldering ruin. The population was annihilated. There are even reports that travelers through the land almost a decade later would come across bones bleaching in the sun because there was just nobody left to even bury the dead. Theodosius II had no choice at this point. He had to call off his North African expedition, recall his troops from Sicily. A hasty and humiliating treaty was formulated with the Vandals of North Africa in which they were given that land, including Carthage. After the troops came back, Theodosius sued for peace. He actually increased the tribute that he was paying to Attila to well over 1,000 pounds of gold annually. All right, let me ask you this. What would you do next if you were in Attila's shoes? Because not only have you successfully invaded the Eastern Roman Empire, but you've given him a black eye. You've wiped out a good chunk of their frontier defenses, you've taken on their cities and proven that they are in fact vulnerable, and what's more, you've managed to extort even more money out of them. I would say that if you were just a simple barbarian, you would just continue to attack and try to pillage and try to steal more stuff. But Attila opted for something different. He opted for consolidation. He made all of his troops come back to the great Hungarian plain. And he knew that there was only one more obstacle that was stopping him from assuming complete power. And he knew that he needed to neutralize that issue before he could continue on. Sometime in the year 445, approximately 2 years after this campaign into the Eastern Roman Empire had ended, Attila's older brother, Bleda, turned up dead. The details of his death are completely unknown. Depending on which resource you get into, there's some accounts, the honorable accounts, that say that Attila challenged his brother for control of the Huns and won. Other accounts state that Bleda died of natural causes, which to me is complete and total rubbish. I think that Attila realized that his time to take over had finally come, and he had enough support in order to do it. I challenge my listeners to look into this. If anybody can come up with a good hypothesis, by all means, let me know about it. But I will say that in my own review of the resources, the term assassination comes up very frequently. Let me give you an example. The following is from a source by a man by the name of Jordanes. He was a Goth and a historian that was writing about Attila in the 6th century. Quote, "When Attila's brother Bleda, who ruled over a great part of the Huns, had been slain by Attila's treachery, the latter united all the people under his own rule,
Gathering also a host of other tribes, which he then held under his sway, he sought to subdue the foremost nations of the world, the Romans and Visigoths. His army is said to have numbered 500,000 men. He was a man born into the world to shake the nations, the scourge of all lands, who in some way terrified all mankind by the dreadful rumors noised abroad concerning him. He was haughty in his walk, rolling his eyes here and there, so that the power of his proud spirit appeared in the movement of his body. He was indeed a lover of war, yet restrained in action, mighty in counsel, gracious to suppliants, and lenient to those who once received into his protection." End quote. Once Attila had firm control over his people, he did something that, in my opinion, was extremely cunning. He exploited their beliefs in order to legitimize his sole leadership. It readily brings to mind something that I read about Field Marshal Irwin Rommel. If you recall, he was the Deutsches Afrika Korps, the commander of German forces in North Africa in World War II, also known as the Desert Fox. He stated, "A commander can work wonders if he has had the wit to create some sort of legend around himself." According to Hun mythos and legend, the true king, the one that was destined to unite all the Huns together, would be gifted a sword by their war god, and Attila completely used this angle. Again, Edward Gibbons, quote, "One of the shepherds of the Huns perceived that a heifer who was grazing had wounded herself in the foot, and curiously followed the track of blood, till he discovered among the long grass the point of an ancient sword, which he dug out of the ground and presented to Attila. That magnanimous, or rather that artful prince accepted with pious gratitude this celestial favor, and as the rightful possessor of the sword of Mars asserted his divine and indefeasible claim to the domination of the earth, and the vigor with which Attila wielded the sword of Mars convinced the world that it had been reserved alone for his invincible arm." End quote. What a brilliant maneuver. Not only did he consolidate his people, but he made his actions appear almost divinely inspired. And this was something that Attila was going to be needing, because several hundred miles to the east, Theodosius II was busy using the peacetime in order to rebuild the Eastern Roman Empire. At this point, he had rebuilt the army and refurbished them. He had rebuilt a couple of the fortifications. He even went so far as to rebuild the Danube fleet, a series of ships so that he could patrol and monitor the Danube. When Theodosius caught word that Attila was vying for sole supremacy over the Huns, he calculated correctly that Attila would be so busy trying to consolidate his power base that he wouldn't have time to deal with the Eastern Roman Empire. So Theodosius stopped all payment to Attila. He even went so far as to make an edict, quote, "For we believe that if military affairs are organized exactly as we have decreed, then in whatever territory an enemy might be tempted to invade, a victory that is advantageous to us, according to the will of God, will be proclaimed even before any battle." End quote. Is this confidence? Is this hubris? Is this stupidity? Perhaps a combination of all three kind of put together? I'll let you decide. But in my mind's eye, I see the following. There's Theodosius sitting on his throne, dressed in purple, all the regala, all the upper administration of the Eastern European court surrounding him, yada yada. And he's telling them, "Hey guys, we don't need to pay Attila anymore. I mean, look what we got. We have our army back, we have our navy, we have a ton of defenses, we have all these towns. There's no way he can get through all of that. And even if he did, and even made it to Constantinople, he would have to deal with the Theodosian walls. And look at those things, guys. They're humongous. There's triple-line defenses. There's towers every once in a while. They have a moat. He couldn't possibly get through that. Right? As far as I'm concerned, Attila can eat cake." And I'm sure Theodosius went to bed that night with a big smile on his face, with this certain degree of confidence. And probably rightfully so. He had probably some of the most impregnable defenses on the planet, and I'm sure he probably went to bed with a smile on his face every night up until January 26th in the year 447. Because, you see, this was the day that he lost both his smile and his confidence. And I can tell you at approximately 2 a.m. he woke up. And the reason I can guarantee you that is because most people don't sleep through an estimated 7.6 Richter scale earthquake. As the light came up over the Bosphorus and illuminated the Theodosian walls, Theodosius was horrified to see that almost an entire mile-long stretch of it was no longer there. But he wasn't the only one that noticed this, because Attila had scouts monitoring this. And as soon as they found an entryway into Constantinople, Attila was on the move once again. The 447 campaign was a lot different than the 441 campaign. This was going to be a race against time. Attila had the speed and maneuverability of his cavalry forces, but the Romans had several lines of defense, they had forts, they even had an army in the field. And Attila, to his credit, realized that he couldn't just blaze in. If he had done so, the Romans could have possibly cut him off from his lines of logistics and support, could have cut off his line of retreat, and he would have found himself completely surrounded. Attila adopted a policy of scorched earth. He wanted to move in such a way that he would hit several key Roman installations on his way towards Constantinople. His scouts had reported to him, after all, that a vast tract of these walls that were defending Constantinople were completely obliterated, and so he figured he had the time. The Romans used a different strategy. They knew that Constantinople was their base of operations, and if Constantinople fell, the Eastern Roman Empire would fall. And they were willing to sacrifice men and troops and cities and forts in order to buy time to rebuild those walls. And what kind of time frame are we talking about? Well, according to several of Theodosius's advisors, they stated that the destruction was so complete that it would take almost 2 years to rebuild the walls. And this was time that Theodosius just didn't seem to have. After all, he was already getting reports that not only had the Huns poured over the border, but they were already taking out the city of Retaria, which was the headquarters of his Danube fleet. And it was only a matter of time before he started getting even more reports that the Huns were moving onwards towards the city of Marcinople, which was kind of the halfway point on their march towards Constantinople. Theodosius had to move quickly. He hired a man by the name of Flavius Constantius with the sole responsibility of rebuilding the Theodosian walls. And then he proceeded to mobilize the Eastern Roman army. He put it under the command of a man by the name of Arnegisclus, and he gave him the responsibility to intercept the Hun army and stop it at any costs at the city of Marcinople. And this is exactly what he did. He marched the Eastern Roman army along the coast of the Black Sea to Marcinople, and then realizing that the Huns were still a distance away, marched it up into the Danube River Valley. The two armies met at a tributary of the Danube by the name of Utus, which is currently the river Vid in northern Bulgaria. Now, Arnegisclus, the general of the Roman army, actually had a very good force under his command. Again, Theodosius had spent time and money to refit and refurbish the army so that it was going to be a very good fighting force. But what Arnegisclus lacked was knowledge of Hun tactics. We should probably talk about this. The Huns relied on mobile warfare at its finest. It was all based on the ability to do lightning raids, to attack an enemy and then be able to withdraw without taking too much damage. Now, if you look at the Hun saddles, it actually allowed the rider to pivot his body so that they could take arrow shots whether they were approaching an enemy or whether they were retreating from the enemy. And this allowed them to sometimes draw the enemy out. They would ride up, fire several shots, and then retreat, or at least feign a retreat, in order to tempt the enemy to chase after them. And what would usually happen is that the enemy force would chase after them, would lose cohesion of their forces, perhaps even lose a little bit of morale, they'd get fatigued, and then there would be several Hun forces waiting in the wings to pounce and ambush this incoming force. Then they would riddle them with arrows, and the job was pretty much done at that point. Let's also talk about the Hun compound bow, because this was also a masterpiece of design. It consisted of wood mixed with sinew mixed with bone, which gave it a tremendous amount of resilience and tensile strength. The process that was required in order to build this bow would take almost a year to build, but the effects were devastating. It's estimated that a Hun bow and arrow would hit you with the same impact as a modern-day bullet. And the Huns knew this. They would use a very famous tactic where they would divide up their forces into two waves of attack, and the first group would shoot their arrows up into the air at a trajectory so that the arrows would land on the heads of their targets, whereas the second group would fire their arrows almost at a horizontal directly into the enemy. And so the result was the enemy would try to protect against one incoming wave and get decimated by the other incoming wave of arrows. Despite this lack of knowledge of Hun tactics, the Roman army actually had a very reasonable performance. They were actually able to inflict a considerable amount of losses on the Huns. Arnegisclus and his force knew that they were fighting for the Eastern Roman Empire. They were fighting to save their very homeland, and they fought ferociously. The story goes that Arnegisclus was on his horse and mowing down people left and right, and his horse got riddled with arrows and died underneath him. And despite that, he was actually able to continue fighting until he himself died on the field of battle. Historians go so far to say that the Battle of the River Uttus, as it became known, came within a hair's breadth of being a Roman victory. Tactically, Attila was able to win the day, but his forces were pretty badly mauled. He had to stop and regroup and refurbish his forces. And so strategically, this was kind of a victory for the Romans because it bought them more time. It gave the builders back in Constantinople just a little bit more time in order to rebuild the walls. However, despite this setback, Attila pushed on. He commanded his forces to move further down the Danube River Valley, almost to the Black Sea. They encountered the city of Marsinople along the way, laid siege to it, and razed it to the ground. This is a city that would not be rebuilt for another 100 years. Attila then ordered his forces south, deep into the heart of Thrace itself, deep into the Balkans. He encountered cities like Philoppolis and Archaedopolis, and he put these to the torch. Other cities actually managed to survive. They were actually able to fend off the Huns, cities like Adrianople and Heraclea. But I want you to keep in mind that each one of these sieges slowed the Huns down, even if it meant a few days here, a few days there. Thus, it wasn't until several months into this campaign that the Huns arrived at what would be known as the Chersonesus, which is the peninsula leading up to Constantinople. It was here that the Romans had put together kind of a last-ditch army at a place called Epirus. Now, if you look at Epirus on a modern-day map, it's actually a suburb of Constantinople, which is, of course, Istanbul now. But it gives you an idea of how close the Huns really were. I mean, this is a suburb that people commute into the city on a daily basis. In any case, the army that was created by the Romans was no match for the Huns. It was immediately dispatched and destroyed, and now the road to Constantinople was completely wide open. Attila maneuvered his forces within striking range of Constantinople, with the intent that he was going to march on the city the next day, destroy it, and bring an end to the Eastern Roman Empire. This, however, was not to be, because when the sun came up and Attila gazed on the walls, expecting to see a mile-long hole, it wasn't there. In fact, in a last-ditch, frenzied attempt, the people of Constantinople were actually able to rebuild the Walls of Theodosis. The man that Theodosius had placed in charge of rebuilding the walls, Flavius Constantius, had truly pulled off a Herculean task. And he had done this by mobilizing just about the entire population of Constantinople itself, including a group of sports fanatics. Two groups in particular, one known as the Blues and the Greens, he used. These are people that you would think of as soccer hooligans today. They were big fans of the Circus Maximus, also known as the Hippodrome. They were very much into their charioteers, but they hated one another. And Flavius Constantius manipulated that hatred. He would pit one against the other in order to rebuild the wall. And this process actually worked. What was supposed to take 2 years this man actually accomplished in 2 months. If you go to Constantinople, which is modern-day Istanbul, and this is something that I recommend that everybody do once in their life, go to the Theodosian Walls. And if you go there, go to the Mevlevihain Gate. It's at the Millet Kadesi bus station, which makes it kind of easy to get there. There's a placard that's up in the wall that actually celebrates and commemorates this man's achievement, because he did nothing less than save not only Constantinople, but save the entire Eastern Roman Empire. Think for a second what a truly incredible accomplishment this really was, because it was the Eastern Roman Empire that preserved humanity and the arts and learning during the time when the rest of Europe was going into the Dark Ages. Where would we be intellectually if this had not occurred? The Theodosian Walls were destined to stand for another 1,000 years. It wasn't until the year 1453 that they were finally breached by Mehmet II and the Ottoman Turk army. And it was only brought down because they had gunpowder and artillery. But Attila didn't have those advantages, and he knew that he wasn't going to get any further into Constantinople. So he pursued a policy of moving away from the capital, but pillaging and destroying everything in his path. He managed to trap a Roman army near Gallipoli and then proceeded to move down into Greece. Some of his forces made it as far down as Thermopylae, which was the site about 1,000 years prior to this where King Leonidas and his 300 Spartans managed to go toe-to-toe with Xerxes and his massive army. Edward Gibbons again gives us a great summary of this. Quote, "The armies of the Eastern Empire were vanquished in 3 successive engagements. The 2 former on the banks of the Uttus and under the walls of Marcinopolis were fought in the extensive plains between the Danube and Mount Haemus. As the Romans were pressed by a victorious enemy, they gradually and unskillfully retired toward the Chersonese of Thrace, and that narrow peninsula, the last extremity of land, was marked by their third and irreparable defeat. By the destruction of this army, Attila acquired the indisputable possession of the field. From the Hellespont to Thermopylae and the suburbs of Constantinople, he ravaged without resistance and without mercy." End quote. I'll leave it up to your imagination to imagine Theodosius II sitting on his throne. Imagine what he had to say to his advisors, because he had to explain that the navy that he was vaunting no longer existed. The army that he talked about was decimated, and he came within an inch of losing the entire Eastern Roman Empire. He had to explain to them that now we have to pay the Huns 6,000 pounds of gold in one huge lump sum. And furthermore, every year we're going to have to increase their annual tribute to 2,100 pounds of gold. It's kind of amazing that this guy didn't end up getting assassinated. Priscus of Panemon, again the contemporary historian, was not very happy with this. He states in his record, quote, "Because of the overwhelming terror that gripped their generals, the Romans were compelled to accept cheerfully every injunction, no matter how harsh, in their eagerness for peace. Even senators contribute a fixed amount of gold. They paid only with difficulty, so that men who had once been wealthy were putting up for sale their wives' jewelry and their furniture. This was a disaster that happened to the Romans after the war, and the result was that many killed themselves either by starvation or by hanging." End quote. Attila achieved a triumph with this. He had the Eastern Roman Empire in his pocket. He had an insane amount of money coming from them in the form of an annual subsidy. He even insisted that a buffer zone be created between the Hun Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire, which meant even more loss of land for the Romans. It was kind of like a demilitarized zone like the one you have between North and South Korea. Being the type A personality that Attila was, he set to work using this money that he was getting to expand his empire. At this point, the Huns controlled a land that spread from the Rhine on one end all the way to the Volga, and from the Danube all the way to the Baltic Sea. It was huge. This was a land area that was comparable to the size of the entire Roman Empire combined. At this point, Attila calculated correctly that the Eastern Roman Empire probably wouldn't give him any trouble for the foreseeable future. Their army was pretty much annihilated. His army had grown to a massive size. He had a secure border with them, and he was extorting an unprecedented amount of money out of them. So it didn't make any more sense to attack them. But his eyes turned westward, and at this point all he needed was an excuse. The Western Roman Empire, up until this point, had managed to avoid the wrath of Attila. Part of this was due in response to the fact that Attila and Aetius had a bit of a friendship going on, and I'm sure Aetius was only too willing to advertise this fact in order to maintain his power base. Aetius was no slackard. He had used this time to improve the Roman army. He had invaded Gaul several times, and he had several successful campaigns under his belt. It was said that his power grew so strong that delegates from other lands would actually present themselves to Aetius instead of Valentinian III, who was the emperor. This didn't go without notice, because Valentinian III, who initially adored Aetius for his successful campaigns, began to truly despise him. But he knew that there was nothing that he could do, because Aetius truly held the keys to holding the Huns in check. What's more, Valentinian had his hands full with the intrigue that surrounded the imperial court. Let's talk about him for a second, because Valentinian was a bit of an idiot. He was, in my opinion, another ineffectual Roman emperor who had no idea what was going on and had a tendency to make completely insane decisions. Kind of the last thing that the dying Western Roman Empire needed at this point in time. His mother, Galla Placidia, was truly the brains of the outfit, but he also had a sister by the name of Justa Grata Honoria, who was perhaps a little bit more cunning, a little bit wiser, and a little bit smarter than he was. But perhaps we're not saying much by saying that. In any case, I would bet you that if she were male, Galla Placidia would most likely have had Valentinian either assassinated or bopped off in some sort of coup and would have put her in charge. But according to the Roman guidebook, the policy was that a woman could not assume the role of emperor. And to make matters even worse for Honoria, she was siblings with Valentinian, which means her only real options in life were to be married off to some random guy in order to solidify either a treaty or a land grab or some sort of power gain. But the policy stated, again from the Roman guidebook, that this only worked as long as she remained a virgin. Valentinian was not going to take any chances with this. He had her locked up in the proverbial tower, put her into a gilded cage, but again, a gilded cage is still a cage, and as one can imagine, this is something that most people would find very resentful. Honoria was bored. She wanted to get back at her brother, and the only way that she could really do it was by sexual innuendo. In fact, the report goes that she was quite the virtuoso when it came to this. But perhaps she went a little too far. When Valentinian found out that she was pregnant, and pregnant at the hands of her steward of estates, her kind of butler, a man by the name of Eugenius, he was understandably furious. His options to marry her off and solidify his power base were gone. So what was he left to do? Well, first things first, Eugenius was put to death, which was, according to the Roman guidebook again, the catch-all cure-all. Valentinian even went so far as to try to apply this policy to his sister and have her put to death as well. And if it wasn't for the intervention of Galla Placidia, he probably would have done this. But he found his own way of getting back at her. He had her engaged to a man by the name of Flavius Bassus Herculanus, who, according to the tradition, was somebody that was kind of resentfully ugly. He was a bit of a dullard, kind of stupid, and at the same time, he was several years older than Honoria. She was beside herself. Not only had she witnessed the death of her lover, but now she was in a situation where she was going to marry somebody that she found detestable. And it was this desperation that led her to do one of the most insane and destructive acts of her entire life. A few weeks later, on the Great Hungarian Plain in Attila's capital, an envoy arrived bearing a package for Attila that came from Honoria. It was for his eyes only, and when Attila opened this package, he was shocked. A smile came to his face. There was a letter in there stating that Honoria was pleading for Attila to come and rescue her. She was going to offer him money and gold and land and titles, etc. And she must have thought it must have been a good idea because she put her signet ring inside of the package. Now, for her, the signet ring would give this envoy a certain degree of authority. But, according to Hun tradition, when a woman puts a ring inside of a package to a man, that is nothing less than a proposal for marriage. Attila, at this point, probably had several wives, but he always could use one more, especially when that wife was a royal. So he pounced on this opportunity because he knew he could play this angle towards his advantage. He immediately sent envoys to the Eastern and Western Roman Empire, indicating to them that he was coming to save this woman, that he was coming to get his bride. And all he wanted for his dowry was half the Western Roman Empire. I wonder what the expression on Valentinian III's face must have been like when he heard about this proposition, and when he realized that his sister had actually instigated this entire thing. I'm guessing that family dinners from here on out must have been kind of a tragic affair. Valentinian didn't have much of a choice at this point. He had to flat out refuse Attila. And Attila finally had the pretext that he needed to declare war and invade. It was not long after this that the wheels that comprised the Hun war machine came back to life. Attila summoned the forces of his massive empire into one gigantic fighting force. It is said that he had almost 100,000 cavalry under his command. And with this army, with this horde, the king of the Huns turned westward, and he was going to unleash a destructive force that would make his exploits in the Eastern Roman Empire seem like a walk in the park. The world was only about to understand the fury that was Attila, and he would live up to his name, the Scourge of God. This ends part 2 of Attila the Hun. I'd like to thank everybody out there for listening and for your patience. If you liked what you heard, please, by all means, give me a like or subscribe. For those of you so inclined, if you have the time, please leave me a couple of comments. I'd love to hear from you guys. In the meantime, thanks again for your time and for your patience. This is Flashpoint History. Be advised that part 3 is already in the works.